Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Scott Darkin, and welcome to our Facebook Live presentation tonight. This is a bit of a first for Baker's Delight, so it's all very new for us, but I hope you're going to enjoy the program over the next hour or so. As many of you would be aware, Baker's Delight has produced what we believe to be the first daily fresh-baked Loaf Fodmap bread. It's the whole grain Loaf Fod loaf. And of course that has a reduced amount of FODMAPs in it and has significant health benefits connected to it. So we're going to be explaining those sorts of things throughout the evening and hopefully tackling a few of your specific questions as well while we're at it. But first, before I go too much further, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Marina Yankovic to the program.
Thank you, Scott. It's really nice to be here.
It's great. Marina, we're very lucky to have Marina here with us tonight. She is very experienced in this field. In fact, I'll just quickly read some of her bio information because it is very impressive. Marina has been with Monash University for more than 10 years and is currently the Senior Project Manager for Monash Fodmap and Head of the Monash Low Fodmap Certification Program. Marina is also a researcher and an accredited practicing dietitian who did a PhD investigating the benefits of a low FODMAP maternal diet to improve symptoms of infantile colic. And we have some breaking news tonight, very exciting. Marina's second paper on that very subject has just been published a couple of hours ago, so congratulations.
Great, thanks Scott, yeah, very timely.
Yeah, very indeed, so we're very lucky to have you here today. Now look, just for a little bit of context before we really get underway tonight, the Monash University has been a leader in the space of particularly researching FODMAPs and so on. So before we go on, I thought it might be a good opportunity just to talk a little bit about what the university has done in this space.
Yeah, sure. It's what we've really done is looked at how diet therapies can actually treat people's symptoms and those have been diagnosed with IBS, because people with IBS for many years will visit their doctor or their gastroenterologist and say that, you know, there's something in their diet and they sense that their food is a trigger. So fortunately, our head of department, Professor Peter Gibson, said, okay, if this is happening, well, we need to do some research behind it and see if diet is actually effective, because drugs has only been as effective as, you know, not very effective. It's been effective in some people, but not satisfactory. So that's where it began. He took on some dietitians in his team who were willing to do some research behind this, and that's where we are today. We now have a diet that is proven to be effective in treating people with IBS.
Great, so there's plenty of research, there's plenty of knowledge behind it, and I expect that we'll be able to explore some of that going forward tonight. So let's get started. Before I do, I would like to point out that tonight's session is an information session as much as anything. It really isn't a forum for us to diagnose any specific problems that you believe that you may have. And our only advice at the moment would be to say that if you do suspect that you have some unusual symptoms that you're not too sure about, please go and consult your doctor. We have received plenty of questions over the last couple of days since we've been talking about this event tonight. We've got some of those here today as well, so we will try and get through as many of those as we can, but please do feel free to send through any questions that you might have during the broadcast tonight, and we'll try and get to those. For those that we can't get to tonight, we will certainly follow up after this broadcast. We'll find some answers for you and we'll contact you directly to make sure that that's all covered off. All right, so on with the show, let's get going. So let's start with some of the basics. We hear the term FODMAPs quite a bit. What exactly are FODMAPs?
Sure, it's actually a term that the team at Monash coined in 2005, so it's been around for some time. And the reason we came up with a term is because we were always saying fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. So you can imagine the continuation of saying that. It became quite difficult, and it's very scientific words, but we ended up coming up with an acronym for it, so hence it was FODMAP. So that made life a bit easier for us, especially when we're writing up publications, and it's really just been taken off from there.
It's become a fairly common and accepted term now, hasn't it?
Yeah, particularly in Australia, yes, because, you know, this is where it started and this is where it was founded. But essentially, they are a group of sugars that are naturally found in our diet throughout all the different food groups that we eat, and they're good for us. They're supposed to be in our diet, but what happens with them is when we ingest these foods and these sugars that are travelling through our gut, they can either be poorly absorbed or indigestible. And some of them are indigestible in all of us. And they're supposed to be, and because they're supposed to get to the end of our gut for all those good bacteria to ferment and have some energy and produce some gas and etc. But the problem with people with irritable bowel syndrome, they have quite a sensitive gut. So these symptoms that we experience that are typical, they're exacerbated in people with IBS, and it's a problem that they experience every day, or at least most days of the week.
Okay, so the process that the gut actually goes through that causes some of this process, that's actually quite a normal and natural thing to happen.
Yeah, sure. So, and these sugars are really small. So what that means is in our gut, it leads to an osmotic effect, which essentially just means it's drawing more water through the gut as well. And so people may experience symptoms, increased water delivery through the bowel, such as diarrhea. But this is for people with IBS. So, and then the other, there's other sugars which are getting to the colon, which is our large bowel, and this fermentation process of these sugars by the bacteria, which are using the sugars as energy, produce gas. So, and that's a normal response.
Right.
So it's more about how those symptoms can then lead to constipation, lots of wind in people that have IBS, and they're normal symptoms. We all experience some gas or some bloating, but for people with IBS, they may also experience some other symptoms.
All right, terrific. Well, we've talked about IBS quite a bit over the last couple of minutes, and I'm sure a lot of people out there do actually know what IBS is, but there may be some newcomers to the space. So can we spend a couple of minutes talking about exactly what IBS is?
Yeah, sure. It's a type of functional gastrointestinal disorder. So it has a physiological response in the sense that it is a syndrome. It is actually quite difficult to diagnose. So it's very important that people get a diagnosis first, because some of these symptoms can be a cause of something more serious. So the reason why it's important that we rule out more serious conditions such as celiac disease, inflammatory bowel disease such as ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, and bowel cancer. So important to get that diagnosis clear first. Most people will probably be diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome, but once it is diagnosed, then we can come up with a proper management for that person. And irritable bowel syndrome really does present with all those symptoms I was talking about, as well as abdominal pain, abdominal distension is one of the common ones. So they could have any number of those symptoms.
Right. Okay. So, do we have any research or evidence to tell us how common IBS is in Australia?
Oh yes, it could be worldwide. Actually, there's a global problem, so it can affect up to 15% of the community. It's been known. Wow. It's been seen as high as 20. Ranges between 10 to 20%. But we turn to use about 1 in 7. We'd say it has IBS, so it's quite a large population.
All right. Well, that's some of the basics covered. And look, there are quite a few questions that we've received already, so we might jump into a few of these. And I thought this was a really good one to start with. This one came from Hannah. Yep. She's saying, I need an easy way to introduce foods again while seeing which foods are the culprit. And this has actually come up a few times, so I think reintroduction of foods is probably a big part of it.
Yes, it is, and that's part of the FODMAP diet. So there's actually 3 steps to the FODMAP diet. So the first step, people will be on a low FODMAP diet, and it's really important, where I mentioned earlier, they get a proper diagnosis, but it's also as equally important too, if you are using diet as a treatment approach, that you're working with a dietitian to do this, because it's really important that we're looking at their entire diet, and we need to really optimise their entire nutrition intake. So the first step is to go on a low FODMAP diet, and the idea behind that is we know that about 3 in 4 people actually improve on a low FODMAP diet, people with IBS.
Right, that is.
So it is incredibly effective and much more effective than a drug therapy. So what will then happen, so after a period of time, so approximately 2 to 6 weeks, depending on how they might see their dietitian, is once they're feeling better and they're happy and symptoms are well controlled, what we look at is them reintroducing a FODMAP. So we've got the oligosaccharides, which consist of sugars that are named fructans and galacto-oligosaccharides. So we'll just use one of those at a time and introduce that back into the diet. So FODMAPs, if you think about, they're little subunits of sugars, so we'll introduce one of those subunits at a time back in the diet. So we'll find a food, for example, that will only contain one of those, and then they'll see how they respond to that, and we increase the dose of that food over 3 days and the serving size, and see how they respond. So it's really important people monitor their symptoms as they progress through a reintroduction stage of their diet, because essentially what we want to do is get to a point where they've personalised their diet.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So they work out what triggers are for them and what are avoided.
And I think that's probably an important thing to point out. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, is it?
No, absolutely not. And the reason for that is people's IBS is variable. So there's no one size fits all, and everyone's IBS symptoms vary from severity to what acceptance.
All right. Well, look, on a similar note, we've got something from Mel as well. Now, Mel said, I've gone through testing and elimination and I've worked out my trigger foods. Numerous specialists have told me to reintroduce them in small quantities, but as soon as I do, my symptoms come back.
Yeah.
Is it okay to just stay on a low FODMAP, avoiding trigger foods, but eating a variety of things?
Well, we actually say that we shouldn't follow low FODMAP diet for life. And the reason for that is because we want to have a much more varied diet and socially being more inclusive and varied when you travel. So if you can't reintroduce them at one point, we encourage people to try again. And the reason for that is because it may not be tolerated at that point, but IBS changes over time. So and that can change due to travel or stress or other types of triggers as well.
Okay, great. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So Kayla, Kayla says, with so much overwhelming information, what's the best way to start? This is probably one of the best questions because a lot of people, I'm sure, have just got no idea.
Yeah, and I think this is why I really do keep encouraging people to, once they've had a proper diagnosis, is seek a dietitian, particularly an expert dietitian in this area. And we do have a lot of tools and that people can actually use. And I know we'll probably mention it, but the app that we have, the Monash Fodmap App, it really gives, there are hundreds of foods there that we've tested over time, over many years, and they can look at them for their FODMAP content. So we use a traffic light system where green represents low FODMAP, amber is moderate, and red is high. So it becomes very easy to be able to identify them, and it takes the science away from it, and no one has to try and learn what the science behind the FODMAP diet.
Yeah, I'm sure the more you can take the science out of it at a day-to-day level is the more useful it's going to be. Yeah. And I think that certainly follows on to the next question, also from Kayla. She's asked some very good questions.
Thanks, Kayla.
Only Kayla.
They're all great questions.
She wants to know, what about managing family life around dietary changes?
Yeah, good one. It's a great one. I think it's important to highlight that anyone can have the high FODMAP foods or the low FODMAP foods, and it's really about not needing to have to create a separate meal because anyone else, which is very important. So you may have additional ingredients on the side for yourself or your family if they're, or remove them from a dish that the whole family can eat. So if there are ingredients that are triggers for you, that's fine. You can cook a meal that you can take them out of, and you can bring in other ingredients for the rest of the family that they like to eat. So there's no need to cook in different pots or pans or ovens or anything like that.
So it doesn't have to be hard?
It doesn't have to be hard.
All right,
no,
well, I think
not
that's
at all.
some pretty good advice there. All right, let's move on to the next one. So Amy contacted us. Now, she had something quite interesting to ask, and I didn't even know this was a thing until we spoke earlier. Has a low FODMAP diet been shown in studies to help people with IBS-C or only IBS-D? So what are those things and do they help?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So IBS-C, to explain, means that someone that has predominantly constipation, irritable bowel syndrome, constipation, and D reference to diarrhea. There's also an IBS-M where it's mixed, so they can alternate from having constipation or diarrhea. So, and yes, we have had studies where they've shown to be effective in people with diarrhea predominant irritable bowel syndrome or constipation and also pain.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so it's, there have been studies all across the world now. So we've had studies in the UK, Canada, US, Scandinavian countries, Malaysia, Hong Kong. So this is not just a Melbourne phenomenon and only effective for us. So yeah,
all right,
it's
great.
pretty widespread.
So just looking here, we've had a comment here from Diane and a little bit of support for Diane. So thanks for writing in, Diane. She actually wants to know the Baker's Delight low-fod bread rolls are delicious, she says, which is absolutely true.
Yes.
But can Baker's Delight please look at creating low FODMAP versions of some other products? Well, I guess the answer to that is, look, we're always looking at how we can create new products in our range that certainly meet some of these needs, but they do take a little bit of time to develop and to make sure that they meet all of the standards that we're looking for and the high quality purposes. So we'll never say never, but I would have to say that there's nothing in the short term that we're looking at on that one. Okay, so a question from Monique. Monique says, I would love some advice on being on a low FODMAP diet when I'm a vegan.
Sure.
Good question.
Great, yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's important to recognise, you know, with vegetarians, vegans, or any other underlying medical conditions, people going on a low FODMAP diet. And I think for anyone that is vegan, and this is where the app will play, it'll be your number one tool, because you can really search for the types of foods that are in your diet, and we do look at vegetarian foods, we look at foods that are across different cultures and typical like Asian cultures. I mean, we're fortunate in Melbourne, we have a very diverse community, so we have the ability to test a range of foods for different cultures and fruits and vegetables. So for vegan, it's important as well because there are some ingredients such as, you know, they use a lot of soybean ingredients within their food, and that could be an ingredient that triggers symptoms for people that have IBS and are following a vegan diet. And I am going to I'm repeating myself, but this is exactly why you need to see a dietitian. Because a dietitian who has the skill set to understand what other nutritional needs you have as a vegan or a vegetarian, or any other underlying medical condition, because we really need to ensure that, you know, some of those micronutrients are not, you know, at risk of being low, such as iron and B12, which is one of and calcium common in a vegan diet.
All right, so some good advice there. Look, Raylene has asked whether the low FOD bread contains gluten. Now, gluten is an issue that comes up a lot when we're talking about the low FOD bread, and I think maybe this is an ideal opportunity because we do have some other questions along these lines. It's not gluten-free, and so what is the difference? Yeah,
and look, it can't be gluten-free because it's being made in Baker's Delight, which is not it would have to be a gluten-free bakery for it to be gluten-free. So what and yes, it does contain gluten. What we have done is actually formulated a bread where we've actually reduced the FODMAPs and also removed some FODMAPs, and we do that by processing techniques but also through using a variety of different flours. So a low FODMAP diet is not a gluten-free diet, and the bread is not suitable for people with celiac disease, and that is a question that comes up. So it's certainly not something for celiac disease.
Yep, okay. So that's a very important distinction to make, so please keep that in mind. Look, I guess we've touched on some of it, but we did receive a question from Tina who really wanted to know what's the difference between low FOD bread and normal bread.
Yeah, sure. And it's really essentially what I was talking about. We've used different flours, I mean, there are a number of ways we can do it, but essentially processing techniques and fermentation processes, as well as using the flours, where we actually have reduced the amount of FODMAP sugars that can typically appear in bread, and really removed some as well.
Yep. Okay, terrific. So Melissa has written into us. Now Melissa says she's not finding her medical practitioner to be very helpful with her bloated feelings that she's getting. Would you recommend a nutritionist or a dietitian? Who should she go and talk to if she's not satisfied?
Okay, good question. So dietitian is clinically trained, so they can look after any other medical conditions that you may have, but also have a look for accredited practicing dietitians, and you can find them on the DAA website. That's the Dietitians Association of Australia. And check that, because some dietitians will use the term nutritionist because it's a term that the wider community understands. But essentially a dietitian is clinically trained and can consider all medical conditions in the practice and their diet as a whole.
All right, great. So Sarah's watching us tonight. Good evening, Sarah, and thanks for writing in. Now, Sarah's actually said we talked a little bit about not having to do separate meals and spending all your life doing all those sorts of things, but she's made a very good point. She's saying it's easy to slip into eating the same things over and over again. Any tips that would help make this easier would be greatly appreciated. I'm sure that monotony and tedium of what you're eating must be a common problem.
It is, and I think it's a common problem regardless of whether you're following a low FODMAP diet or not and don't have a need for a therapeutic diet. It's something that it's like what's for dinner tonight is, I guess, a common question when you're going home and that you've got a family, or even for yourself, what shall I eat for dinner tonight? We have an enormous recipe index on our webpage. I know we can talk about that later, but at monashfodmap.com, and if you go to our blog post, you'll actually see right at the top a recipe index. So there's hundreds of them. So feel free to tap in there, but there are so many different ideas that you can apply.
Okay, and just looking through these, we're seeing some wonderful questions coming through, so thanks very much for sending them in. Keep them coming. Carla's written in, I thought this was an interesting one. Are the portion sizes per day or per meal? How do you break it down? How do you know that you've got the right ratios?
It's important that people eat according to what their energy needs are, and what I mean by that is what their calorie intake should be to maintain a healthy body weight. So that's the first thing. If we're talking about portion control in terms of FODMAP intake, again, the app, you don't have to understand, because it's really a scientific analysis where every ingredient and every food and every product that comes to our lab is scientifically tested to understand what level of FODMAPs it contains, and all of those sub-sugar units that I'm talking about have a different level of tolerance. So we've actually developed the cutoffs for FODMAP and what is tolerated based on all the research we've done.
Right. So all the hard work's taken out.
So all the hard work's taken out. No one should have to try and guess what the portion size is. The app does that for you. It gives you serving sizes. So it really is a science. So you don't even need to read ingredients on packets, because that won't even give you the answer.
Okay, thank you. Varaday has written in, says Varaday is getting healed from is getting healed from an elimination diet a thing? And I think this is probably an interesting thing for us to talk about as well, in terms of, can you be healed from this?
Yeah, well, there is no cure per se of IBS. I mean, we don't actually know what causes IBS. We understand what some of the triggers are, and we understand that there are sensitivities and symptoms associated based on these triggers. And some often it is food, but it can be other triggers such as stress, for example. So elimination, we're not actually eliminating anything in a FODMAP diet. We simply are replacing or swapping high FODMAP containing foods, or those rich foods such as onions and garlics might be a bit problematic for some people, and we're replacing them with alternatives, but they're lower FODMAP alternatives.
Right.
So all the food groups are included, and there's no reason to actually eliminate anything. So it's not gluten-free, FODMAP-free, or dairy-free per se. So being healed is probably not what we can't heal you, but you can certainly personalise your diet so you can manage your symptoms and be well on a regular basis. There will be moments where food might initiate more triggers because you've eaten out, you're travelling, you're in a social setting, but again, you'll know how to get that back under control eventually, because it is long term is where we want you to be, is be able to personalise your diet to suit your tolerance.
Okay, so it's not so much about finding a cure, it's about a lifestyle, having a good lifestyle.
Yes, absolutely. It is about a balance in your lifestyle.
All right, great. Okay, Mia has contacted us. Mia's got an interesting question. She says she's on a well-controlled FODMAP diet, but when she eats deep-fried chicken and pork belly or pork crackling, she gets all the symptoms. She's assuming that it's the fat content. So is there any research into the amount of fat that could be triggering IBS? Good question.
Good question, yes, and there is. Fat can be a trigger for IBS, and it's not just about the FODMAPs. There are other food triggers, as well as I mentioned stress before. Caffeine can also be a trigger for some people. So
no, surely not.
Yeah, unfortunately for some. But if you haven't got IBS, then I wouldn't worry about it too much. But it doesn't mean you can't have any caffeine.
Yep.
It might mean that you just might want to choose when you have it, or have a small amount. But fat, it can be certainly, if you're having excessive amounts of fat, that can be a trigger for some people.
Okay, all right. So it's a possibility.
Yeah, possibility.
Okay. Look, I'd like to come back to a topic that we touched on earlier. Bloating. Now, bloating has come up a number of times in some of the questions that we've received here. So I know we've talked about what causes it, but I guess, is there anything that people can do to manage it a little bit better, or to relieve the symptoms, or anything like that?
Yeah, it is one of the ones that, especially in practice, that the one that people really find that bothers them the most.
Yeah.
Aside from passing gas 50 times a day, and they're always around people, but bloating seems to be one of the ones that really is a bother. And I think it is, your clothes feel uncomfortable, you feel uncomfortable, and we can all relate to that. I think it is finding a balance between what is normal, because having some bloating is a normal response to the gas that your bacteria is actively producing because of the fermentation process that it undergoes when they're using the sugars as an energy source. But if it's a problem every day and it's really difficult for you to manage, then a low FODMAP diet could help. And seeing, you might want to see other alternatives to that. And again, it depends. Is it bloating and distension because of constipation as well? Is really something that needs to be worked out. So
it could actually be a combination of things
rather
than any one thing.
Yeah, but it is one of those ones that we all have experienced. It's like, I've had this big meal and I feel a bit bloated.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, as it turns out, Tegan's just contacted us. Thanks for the question, Tegan. She's listed a couple of products that she uses to ease the symptoms. I probably won't say exactly what they are, but are there products out there that people can use to sort of alleviate some of the symptoms if they're experiencing them excessively? Yeah,
sure. I think in terms of products, obviously aside from food, we have we need to look at people's fibre intake as well. Whether it's on a low FODMAP diet or in their diet in general. And so when we are trying to remove some of those higher FODMAP foods, essentially we're changing the type of fibre we're having in our diet. And this is why, again, I know I'm going to say it again, but it's important why you see a dietitian, because we want to make sure your fibre is adequate. So, but if food is difficult to get that fibre into your diet using food and ingredients and products on the market, there are some fibres that you can actually use to actually help you, and these fibres can actually help you with constipation and diarrhea.
Right, really?
Yeah, so we do have, if you have a look in our app, some certified products that are out on the market now that have been incredibly helpful.
Great. Yeah. Well, that's some good advice.
Yeah.
Very good. All right, question from Alison, and I think this comes back to one of the things that we were talking about before. We were talking about variety in your food and not getting bored.
Yeah.
And she said, what can be a substitute for garlic and onion? It's hard to get a flavour that works, and I can imagine it would be. So what would you say?
I guess, we find it easy because we know this inside out, but we do have some, again, I'm going back to a blog, but we have some tips on that. But the first things that we recommend is, if anyone's never tried espotita, it's a great herb spice that you can find at an Asian grocery. But you can actually use, for example, green part of the spring onion, the stalk.
Really?
So that is Loaf Fodmap. And you get some great onion flavour out of that.
Great.
You can use chives. There's lots of herbs and spices you can use, whether they're fresh or dry, that are Loaf Fodmap, but you can use chives. So that will give that flavour. And you can use garlic-infused oils or onion-infused oils, where you're simply just placing some garlic cloves in some oil or olive oil and letting that take on the flavour of the garlic.
Yep.
And then before you add it into your cooking or a salad or a dressing of sorts, remove that garlic clove, and there you have some
Great.
Garlic flavour.
Some really good tips there. So you don't have to miss out at all, really.
No, you don't. No, and it does work. I've tried it. I've tested these things out.
Just had a couple of people writing in just asking for you a bit more information about the blog that you were referring to earlier, if you'd like to talk about where people can find that.
Yeah, sure. So it's on monashfodmap.com is our website, and you'll see at the top a tab for blog. And we'll have a recipe index at the top. But if anything that we're discussing today, or you have a query about your IBS or any other your symptoms or any other treatments for IBS, if you want to look at the latest research in IBS, if you use the search bar there, you can find many blog posts. We've been writing these blog posts since probably 2012.
Right, okay.
So, and we have an enormous library for you. So, yeah, so if you anything you want to find out about our team, other people's research, it's not just about us.
Yep.
We share all the information. So we have a great team behind us and do a lot of this work.
Great. Sounds like a good place to start.
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening to Mandy. Mandy's watching us all the way from the Netherlands, believe it or not. So welcome, Mandy. Now, she's got an interesting question. She's just said that since elimination, it seems that when she does have high FODMAP foods, which she's intolerant to, the reaction seems to be much heavier than before. Is that a fairly common thing if you suddenly, if you've eliminated it and you suddenly bring it back into your diet?
Yeah, well, I guess the main school of thought there is, you're feeling so well, and you bring something at you, or is a trigger for you. I think what tends to happen is you're more aware of those symptoms, and the extreme is more noticeable. So you're so well, whereas before you were not feeling so great, and you remove them and you think, I'm feeling so much better, and then you bring them back in completely, then you're really going to notice it. It's going to seem pretty bad, and especially if you've been feeling so well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we find, especially in practice, we find that's what tends to happen. But it is something that people experience, and it really is about just finding the amount that you can manage.
All right.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, I hope that helps you, Mandy, and thanks for joining us all the way from the Netherlands. Question from Sharon. Sharon says, should those with IBS get tested for celiac disease?
If they haven't, then yes. Yes. If you haven't been tested for celiac disease, it's very important to do that first before a diagnosis of IBS. Absolutely.
Okay. Tegan's contacted us. Tegan says she's tried the low-FOD bread. The low-FOD bread. However, I still appear quite bloated after a few slices. Is there a daily limit to it, or should I investigate further into my intolerances? I think this is a fairly common question as well. What about the number of slices of bread that people can really eat? Yes.
So we've actually certified the low-FOD bread to be 2 toast slices. So, and that is low FODMAP. But if you are going to have multiple serves, then yes, you're increasing your intake of your FODMAPs. The other thing is, so that is per sitting of a meal. The other thing to consider is having multiple serves throughout the day. So you're building up your
yes.
dose and throughout a day as well. So if you're having a couple of slices at breakfast and a couple of hours later, you know, or 3 hours later, you're having some for lunch and then you're having some for dinner. So you also need to consider some of the other ingredients you're having with it. So it's important that if you are at the first step of a FODMAP diet, because just keep in mind we do have 3 steps. We're not just staying on step 1 where we're having a low FODMAP diet, is that we're looking at some of the other ingredients that we're eating with the bread. So it's really important that we accompany it with low FODMAP ingredients.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you started answering that question, you did say that the university has certified the whole grain low FOD loaf. What exactly does certified mean? What's the definition behind that?
Yeah, it's really important that when you call out something that is low FODMAP, that you've actually had an endorsing body tested. So based on the food regulation laws here and in New Zealand and other parts of the world, that you actually cannot make that claim without an endorsing body. So Monash University is that endorsing body where we actually test the food and ensure that they meet the cut-off criteria that we developed that's supported by the evidence. So being certified means you get our stamp of approval, and that's represented by our stamp and icon, which is our blue gut icon, and you get to use our trademarks, which means you are licensed to say that this product is low in FODMAPs.
So that should essentially give people confidence that they can safely consume it.
So you to read an ingredients list or go into store and say what's the ingredients of this and then try and make an educated decision about whether that's a low FODMAP product is virtually impossible. So without actually having a testing the product in its entirety, you cannot call it out as being low FODMAP without it being properly tested. It's very different to for people with celiac disease, where you can start to read labels on an ingredients list. You can't do that with FODMAPs because it's the interaction of the sugars at play have a role to test as well.
Okay, terrific.
Yeah.
So we've had a couple of questions just about Crohn's disease and what the relationship might be. Jacob sent in a question. Hi, Jacob. And he's just said, would you say this sort of diet that we're talking about, would it help someone with Crohn's disease? Yeah,
we've done some studies and other parts of the world where they've looked at inflammatory bowel disease such as Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. There's been some great studies in the UK as well. And because people with inflammatory bowel disease experience IBS symptoms, they have found a low FODMAP diet to be beneficial for them as well. But I say that with caution because we're not actually treating the condition of inflammatory bowel disease, which can be diagnosed as under a scope, I guess. There's diagnostic tools that we have to diagnose someone with celiac disease because it actually damages the lining of your gut, as well as those that have inflammatory bowel disease. There's no diagnostic tool for IBS, and this is why it's really difficult because it's based on their symptoms and how often and how frequently, and there's a criteria around diagnosing IBS. So what we're doing with inflammatory bowel disease and maybe some other conditions that have a side effect of IBS is actually treating the IBS symptoms.
I see, yeah.
So it's just be mindful that we're not necessarily treating the underlying disease. And that, yes, there has been studies to support its effectiveness in inflammatory bowel disease.
Interesting. I hope that answers your question, Jacob.
Yeah, so thank you.
So we've talked about gluten-free. How about this question? I have IBS and can't eat seeds. So will there be a loaf as a whole meal option? Well, again, as I was saying before about some of our products, we're always looking at these sorts of things to try and work out where we might be able to help people like you. That's a nameless person who sent in the question. But in the short term, that's not something that we're going to be looking at, certainly in the short term. But I wonder whether we could talk a little bit about not being able to eat seeds. Is seeds a real trigger for IBS?
It can be. I mean, seeds are great for us, so it's good to see them as part of the low FOD loaf. But it is one of those triggers that may affect someone with IBS. Not everyone. It's not something that we would say to everyone that has IBS, go on a seedless diet. and because there's certainly no evidence to suggest it's one of the most effective approaches. But this is why it is important to see a dietitian, because a low FODMAP diet is very effective, but there may be one or other two ingredients that are your trigger outside of the FODMAP diet.
Well, Jacinta's actually written into us as well, and she's asking about the positive effects of a plant-based diet when you have some of these symptoms. So is that something that can be beneficial?
Oh, absolutely. And I think what we need to keep in mind is anyone that changes their diet, depending on where it was at the start, are probably going to make some improvements. And that's because we ultimately end up having a better diet because we've cut out, and there's a lot of evidence around this, that we've cut out some of the takeaway foods and processed foods, and we've gone back to probably cooking more, preparing our own meals, and being mindful about what we're eating. So when you're making a change like that and it has a positive impact on you as well, mentally, it's going to feel better.
All right. Mel has contacted us. I thought this was rather amusing, actually. She says, is there a good way to start the FODMAP if you're a bit, lazy? She says she's asking for a friend, so I hope your friend's not watching. But is there a simple way to actually get started and see what it does for you?
I mean, I obviously don't want to start to give any advice to people's friends or anything, but it might be just, we don't always need to start strictly. So being on a low FODMAP diet doesn't have to be as strict as people think. If they're a bit lazy and think, I might just try and reduce some of the ones that I know I eat a lot of. And the more common ones are going to be your onion, your garlic. I might reduce maybe some of my bread intake and have a low FODMAP option, such as the low FOD bread. Yep. And making those simple changes. Yep. And have a look at some of those fruits that you're eating. If you're eating, some people, I see people in practice, and especially children, we're having 3 apples a day. So that's going to be a problem for most people. Yes. or having 2 litres of milk a day. So. Yep. We need to put this into perspective and realise that it's a FODMAP diet is and reducing them to avoid triggers is one way, but also if we're eating a particular food to excess, is probably going to cause some problems.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that question. Certainly one of the more common questions that we do get, this does come up a lot. Yeah. If this bread contains wheat, how can it be low FODMAP? So can we explore that a little bit, please?
Yeah, sure. I think it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. So wheat contains fructans, but what we're doing is actually, through our processing methods, we actually can remove them and reduce them. So, and we can combine some with other flours that are just as palatable and has the same texture and work just as well. So it's these ingredients don't have to be completely removed, but we are reducing them.
Okay. All right. So look, we've got a couple of other questions here. So another one from Mandy. She says she's got another question. Is it true that you have to introduce high FODMAPs into your diet once in a while to see if you're still intolerant to them? And is it even possible that the intolerance goes away after a while?
I think what happens, we know what happens with IBS is it changes over time. So yes, you can be less tolerant to some ingredients at one point and more tolerant over another time. And it depends what's going on. So it might depend on what other foods you're having with it. It might depend on stress. So when we have some high stress in our lives, that can exacerbate some of those symptoms we experience. So, it really is variable. But yes, I think the answer is, I know the answer is sometimes there'll be foods that you're tolerating well, and then other times you won't tolerate them as well. So you really need to start playing around with your dose, and eventually you will get to learn what dose is safe for you and where you may cross the line.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of education within the community, I'm interested to hear about the number of people that come and see you and you talk to all the time. Are you sensing that there's a change in people are a lot more educated, they're understanding things a lot more about what we're talking about here and starting to make those changes?
Absolutely. I also think they're feeling so much better, and they're really empowered because they have control over their, not only just their lives again, but also their diet, and they're in control of that. So, and it's much more appealing than having to have a drug that
That's for sure,
becomes expensive, and it's ongoing, whereas food is a very attractive option for people, because we are all invested in what we eat, and have a big interest in what we eat. So it's quite an empowering approach. But people are certainly being educated, especially if they, people are well informed now on, we have great websites. I mean, our Monash Fodmap Facebook group, which we are very active. Our team is great at responding to questions on Twitter, on Facebook, Instagram, and we're constantly educating them. So giving them the latest evidence, giving them the latest foods that we've tested, and trying to make sure they're well informed so that they can then make their own decisions as well. That's going to suit them. So yes, they are becoming more educated, and it's an empowering tool for them.
And how, just on a personal note, how does that make you feel when you're seeing people coming in and you're working through it all and you're giving them solutions?
Oh, it is incredible, because it's an area that we actually see a big difference, and we can make a difference and help them get control back in their day-to-day activities. So, people with IBS have been experiencing symptoms for years. I mean, I hear stories about, this was happening to me since I was a child, and I knew there was something, and people think I'm crazy, and I tried the gluten-free diet and I felt a little bit better, but not quite, and so there's amazing stories that we get in our team as well, about the great work we're doing. You've changed my life, and people are really seeing a huge difference. So it's really it's really amazing for our team to get these feedback. It means that what we're doing is incredibly worth it.
Well, that's fantastic to hear, and we've certainly received a lot of good feedback about the loaf as well. We've had a lot of people write into us and say that they're this has been life-changing because they haven't been able to eat bread at all, or they've had to eat gluten-free bread, which sometimes isn't the best as well.
And I think it gives people the option. So I think it goes back to some of the earlier questions about how does this help my family eating? It's like, well, you can go in there and buy a bread that's going to be suitable for all of you.
Yep, terrific.
Yeah.
All right, well, look, we're just about at the end of our live broadcast tonight, and I'd like to thank you all very much for the fantastic questions that you've sent in throughout the evening, and certainly leading up to this broadcast. I guess the most important thing for me to do is to thank Marina for joining us today. It's been fabulous having you in here and answering some of these some tricky questions too, I must say. Yeah,
it's been great being here, and the questions have been terrific, so thank you. Thank you to everyone following.
Now, I would like to reassure you that, as I said at the start of the broadcast, that we will be taking on all of the questions that have been sent in. We'll go and find some answers for you, and we'll follow up with them. So rest assured, if we didn't get to it tonight, there will be an opportunity to have your question answered. I would also like to make a quick mention again of the Monash Uni Fodmap Diet app. We have talked about it a little bit tonight, but where would people go, and what can they expect to see?
Let's cover it again. I think, so go to your store, your app store, and you can download that as iPhone or Android. There is a cost associated with it, but that actually, the proceeds from the sale of the app go back to contributing to further research and us to continue testing the food. So it is the biggest database of FODMAP tested foods since we started this. So that's where they can find that. Any further information, our website, monashfodmap.com, and follow us on social media. Again, it's Monash Fodmap, so you can't go wrong. It's the only thing you need to remember.
Nice and easy to remember. And of course, you can find out everything that you need to know about the whole grain Loaf Fod Loaf at bakersdelight.com.au. So once again, thank you again, Marina. Thanks. You for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next time.